to introduce Curt Thompson. And the subject of the first talk is Shame, the Details of Devouring. So Curt, over to you.
Jay, thanks so much for your kind introduction and for inviting me to be part of this gathering. I tell people that, if that following Jesus is not an easy thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. But the brain is able to do a lot of really hard things if it doesn't have to do it by itself. And our topic this morning is going to be about shame and what God is doing to redeem that and how that plays into our stories and what we can do about that in really concrete ways. And I just want to, say from the outset that this is not a topic that I have mastered. This is a topic that I'm living chest deep in, and that I also have my own journey that I'm in the middle of, and find that I'm not going to get through from one day to the next unless I also have what we will talk about in our third talk about this cloud of witnesses, this group of other people who are helping us to see Jesus and to pay attention to ourselves more fully, to tell our stories more truly, and to therefore live in the world that God has made and live in the world in the way that God has intended us to live in it. So I come to you this morning as one of you, and I come to you also saying that I never am part of any of these gatherings, but that I don't also have the opportunity for my life to be changed in the way that I hope that others' lives can be changed. And so we're assuming that in our gathered time today, that the Holy Spirit is in this even virtual room. The Holy Spirit is here, and the Holy Spirit is on the loose. The Holy Spirit is at work. And it's also possible, as you know, I'm gonna share a lot of information with us today. And as I tell other audiences, at the end of our day, we're not going to be a lot smarter. We're going to have access to more information, but my job is to help us be energized to leave our time today and then go home and do the work that I know that all of you are already doing in really energized and passionate ways. And again, just back to that beginning of saying that following Jesus is hard to do. If it weren't, the gate wouldn't be narrow. The gate would be really wide and the road would be really broad. But I didn't make up that story. That's what he said. And life seems to be bearing that out. So with that in mind, I want us to begin this first talk by saying the details of devouring evil and our disintegration. We're going to talk in this first talk about the mechanics of shame. Now, I can go into all kinds of clinical and research data on this topic. But at one level, we could start out by saying, look, I don't need to educate anybody here about what shame is. Nobody needs to give you a definition in one sense, in that we all kind of get a sense of what that feels like. We all get a sense of what it is like when we are feeling ashamed. We have lots of words for it. We can say we're embarrassed. We could say we're humiliated. We could say a number of different things. But we are going to talk a little bit about how it actually operates in and between minds and why it's important for us to have some sense of what those mechanics are really like. And I also want to suggest this, though, and we'll get to this even in more detail in our second talk this morning, and that is that we're going to talk about the mechanics of shame, momentarily. But the title is intentional. When we talk about the details of devouring, as C.S. Lewis once wrote, that evil's intention is that its intention is to devour us. Its intention is not just to use shame to have us feel bad. Its intention is to devour us and to prevent us from bearing God's image by creating beauty in the world. We were intended not just to look like God, talk like God, think like God, but to create like God, to steward the creation in this way. And so we're not in this work today just to keep ourselves from doing bad things, just to keep ourselves from lusting. We want to be people who are commissioned to create in the way that God has intended for us to create. And so with this in mind, let's jump right into what shame actually looks like from a neurophysiologic standpoint. And speaking of neurophysiology, I want to say this, that before anything, we all have moments that we can imagine, even as we're sitting here today together. You can imagine, if we were to raise our hand, we could say, like, well, who among us has had an incident even in the last week in which we felt ashamed. We could probably raise our hand. What about the last, couple of days? We could probably raise our hand. Heck, even this morning, we're not that far into this morning, and we could raise our hands, like something that's happened either between myself and someone else or within my own mind, in which shame has raised its head for us. And so we know that this thing happens and we know what it feels like. Here's what it looks like from a neurophysiology standpoint. And the first thing is this: shame is not an abstraction. Shame is not an idea. Shame, first and foremost, is a neurophysiological event. It is a thing that happens in our bodies. Now, it takes place in terms of what we think about and what we image and what our emotional states are, of course. But its impact is primarily one of neurophysiology. And the metaphor that we use, that Alan Shore, a neuropsychologist on the West Coast, likes to use, is the notion of what it's like to be driving a standard transmission automobile. Human beings are organisms that have an accelerator, and we call that accelerator our sympathetic drive system. From the time babies are born, they come into the world and they are in go mode. They just go, 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 unless they're sleeping. Go, go, go. And at some point, that accelerator, that gas pedal, that accelerator needs to be slowed down. And typically, infants themselves, toddlers, are not going to slow themselves down. They need the assistance of an adult, and the adult will say, no. The adult will have to be their decelerator. And when the adult does that, when the adult says no, hopefully in an appropriate way, when the adult says no, you actually activate that toddler's what we call parasympathetic drive system. So we have a sympathetic drive system that works in sympathy with us. Some of us are familiar with that as our fight or flight mechanism, which is true, but it doesn't only serve that purpose. It works in sympathy with us with what we want when I'm in go mode. The decelerator, the parasympathetic system, gets activated when the brake has to be applied. Now, what makes Shore's metaphor so powerful is this: that the engine of a standard transmission automobile has an accelerator and it has a brake, but it also has something else. It has a clutch, for those of you who drive standard automobile transmissions. And we know that if a car decelerates and the clutch is not applied, what happens? The car does not just stop, the car stops violently. I still have this memory. Speaking of shame, right? So I still have this memory. My older brother taught me to drive my first 1978 Chevy Chevette 4-speed. And I still have the memory of me sitting at the town square, going through the second, the third round of the red light, the green light, the yellow light, the red light, the green, because I can't find first gear. And I'm the first car with cars coming behind me, waiting for me to find first gear to get the car to move. Standard transmission automobiles need the clutch in order to navigate the go mode and the decelerator, the accelerator and the decelerator. For human beings, as Shore points out, here's what shame is. Shame is a neurophysiologic event and our sensations of what happened when our engine decelerates, but no clutch is applied. And what is the clutch for human beings? For human beings, the clutch is a deeply connected interpersonal relationship. Think about this. When an infant is moving, they're going, 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 and then the parent says no. It's not just that the parent says no, it's how they say it. It's how they apply it. And am I, as a parent, saying to the child no, but in a way that keeps me connected? Even if the child is doing something more for which I must say no, in a strong, sudden way, am I quickly able to recover that by going to the toddler and connecting with them? But this doesn't just happen with toddlers. You're sitting in a boardroom meeting and you have an idea and you offer it and someone shuts that down. No nuance, no relational connection. You're at a cocktail party, you're at a meeting, you're at a party where you're having a conversation with 3 or 4 other people and you make some comment and the other 3 people just kind of go, like they just go on as if like you've not spoken at all. You're kind of invisible. There's a certain sense in which you've been decelerated with no human connection. And in this way, what happens in the brain is that our brain translates that we have been in some kind of acceleration mode. I've offered an idea. I'm interested in something. I long for things. I desire things. I am moving towards something, and something shuts that down with no connection available. And this doesn't just happen with parents and children. This happens with us all the time in all kinds of settings, both large and small. Here's something else then that we know about shame. So first we know that it's this neurophysiological event that can happen in all kinds of settings. That really is what happens when we decelerate without the clutch. Here's another important piece. This is a neurophysiologic event that begins early and it happens often. Human beings can experience the phenomenon of shame as early as 15 to 18 months of age. Why is that important? Because we can start to pick this up, sense these things happening to us without and before we have any language, before we have any way of explaining what's going on, before we have any way of understanding, before we have any way of talking about what's going on. It's early and often, which means we've been practicing this in our own bodies for a long time. We're really good at it. And we find ways to cope with it that are also practiced without thinking about how it is that we're practicing how to cope with these neurophysiologic events. The third thing that happens is that shame, the neurophysiology of shame, has a disintegrating effect. And what do I mean by disintegration? Well, this gets to when we talk about in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, we talk about the notion of integration. It's a particular word. It means something in that field. And I liken it to what happens with an orchestra. An orchestra is an organization that has different parts. You have woodwind, strings, brass, percussion. Each of those parts must be well differentiated. They must each practice their parts, but they also must come together and be linked. They must listen to each other, and they need a conductor to help them do this. So it's a well differentiated, linked organization that has a conductor that brings all of that together. That is an example of an integrated system. Our mind, in a similar way, does multiple different things. We have the neural networks that represent what we sense, what we image, what we feel, what we think, what we do with our bodies. That's a kind of an oversimplification of those 5 different ways that we do things as human beings. But each of those things requires well differentiated exercise. Many of us grew up in homes where we didn't talk much about emotion. Anger, I grew up in a house where, I grew up in Eastern Ohio. Now, I don't know if this is true for anybody else or if this is just like an Ohio thing, but like in Ohio, I think parents were sent home with this one discipline tool, and it came to me as this: you stop your crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about. Now, this was kind of like the standard operating procedure for my dad. And my dad was a guy who loved God, loved people, generous, affectionate, warm, but you didn't cross him. And one of the things that was true about our house was my dad was not an angry guy because a lot of us were making sure that we didn't piss him off. And what this means is you're working really hard because you're afraid that if anger shows up in the house, bad things are going to happen. Now, you don't know this as a kid. I'm not thinking to myself as a 5-year-old, my dad really needs to go to therapy. My dad really needs to go talk to somebody. I'm not thinking these things. I'm just living with this sense that you only find out about when you're 40, that, oh, that's what I was doing. I was actually afraid of anger because when your dad's 6'2" and weighs 210 pounds, you don't mess with the guy. Not because he was ever physically threatening, but you just live with that sense. And so, for instance, in my house, there were certain emotions that never got processed, certain parts of the symphony that really never got any practice. And so you know what happens. You get married to somebody who has no problem being angry. And you're like, this is not what I was planning for. I did not sign up for anybody who would be angry. I thought this was not allowed. If this part of the symphony does not get exercised, we are not an integrated whole. Well, what does shame do? Shame disintegrates a system. I tell folks, shame is like somebody drives a 4x4 onto the stage and just runs over the orchestra. Think of when you sense shame, how easy is it for you to think clearly? How easy is it for you to create? How easy is it for you to plan how to talk about what you feel? How much do you want to, with your body, be in the presence of somebody else? No, we are disintegrated when we find ourselves in these states. Not only that, we move from disintegration to isolation and hiding. We actively prevent myself from telling you about these particular parts of my life. So I hide them from myself, and then I hide me from you. And so shame is not just something that happens within me, it happens between us. Because shame, we must remember, is always a relationally mediated neurophysiologic event. I sense shame within me. It may be about me, but it is always in relation to somebody else, which will get muted in terms of how important it is for relationships in the healing of shame. Another important feature of shame is that it moves us, interestingly enough, that word move, it moves us toward stasis. And this is really important, as we'll get to in the second time of our second section today. Stasis, being static, being immobile, is ultimately a sign of death. One of the most important things that we know about, one of the more common pieces of evidence of biological life, from a bacillus of a pneumococcus pneumonia to an animal, is movement. We've all seen dogs be ashamed. We've all watched what happens when a dog cowers, lowers his head, tail between its legs, eyes down, hard to look, and just stays still. We turn into ourselves, literally. When we are ashamed, we turn away, our shoulders move down and together. We were meant to create, and to create requires movement. And evil's intention to wield shame is an intention to keep us from creating in the world. Not only is it this, it is self-perpetuating. Shame tends to be self-perpetuating in that we feel shame, and then we feel shame for feeling shame, and it only builds on itself. Its cognitive dimension that is significant is the cognitive dimension of condemnation. If there's any comment that differentiates shame, for instance, from guilt, we would like to say, guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. And we find 100 different ways to condemn ourselves. In this way, we like to say that most of what shame can be distilled into is this sense of I am not enough. I'm not enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not able enough. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. And whatever the I'm not enough statement is, it finds almost an infinite variety of places to show itself. I don't have what it takes to even be in recovery, let alone remain sober. I don't have what it takes to be in this group. At some point, somebody is going to see enough of me, they're going to get tired of me, and they're going to say, would you just please go? This notion of condemnation is profoundly important because of how it actually shows up. One of the things that we notice about shame is that for many people, their experience of it is such that, we can have particular events in our life in which shame says you're not enough. But most, by far, of the volume of activity that shame occupies in our lives takes place in the privacy of our own brains. It takes place in the privacy of our own minds, where I say, I should have done this, I should have done that. Ugh, what an idiot. All the hundreds, dozens of ways every day that in our mind, we imagine some version of the deceleration of our life with no clutch applied. And this, of course, is the danger, and how shame becomes so infectious and so malignant is that, as we said, when there's no interpersonal connection to be the clutch to protect us from shame, when shame gets loose in the privacy of my own mind, there's no other relationship in there coming to stop it. It is me on a rampage against myself. Now, the thing is, we have all kinds of other ways then that we cope with this, which we'll talk about in the next section. We cope with my shame by ignoring it, by denying it, by my addictions. This is one of the ways that I cope with it. But one of the things that I am most powerfully coping with is the experience of abandonment. We read in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, when God is forming the man, he notices that it is not good for man to be alone. And that statement alone, from a human meaning standpoint, from a human anthropology standpoint, this notion that it's not good for man to be alone is key to what it means for us to flourish. Because evil knows that isolation will kill us. We can talk forever and a day about what the pandemic is doing to not just heighten that, but also, as we say, to reveal just how isolated we were long before the pandemic ever showed up. And so shame is a harbinger of abandonment, that we are going to be left. One of the ways that we talk about shame in the work that we do with patients and in the book that I've written is this notion of how we each have our own personal shame attendant. Now, I like to imagine this attendant that we each hire. I don't know about you, but for me, my alarm goes off in the morning and I open my eyes and my shame attendant is standing there. He's already had his shower. He's dressed. He's ready for the day. And he's standing and he's looking at me and he's saying you're already late. And then, you're okay. So welcome to Monday, right? And then I get up and you go to the bathroom where there are mirrors. I don't know why we have mirrors in bathrooms. Well, especially before I've had my shower. And then I look in the mirror and I'm like, I have to go to work with that today. This is what my shame attendant is reminding me of. There he is dressed in his bow tie and his suit, all that I'm paying for. We kind of get it, right? Imagine if you could make a list of all the times and ways in which shame shows up in how you sense, image, feel, think, or behave in the course of a day. Imagine if instead of them just showing up in your mind, it was your shame attendant who was providing all of that wonder for you. By the end of the day, by the end of an hour, you'd want to kill him. You wouldn't just want to fire him, you'd want to kill him. But I grew up, I was raised as an evangelical Quaker, and so I couldn't do that. I wouldn't be allowed to kill him. I'd hire an Anglican. That's what I would do. Like an Anglican or Presbyterian could do that work for me pretty well. But this is what's important for us to consider, that it is evil's intention to use our shame to devour us. And as we get to this last part of our time in this first talk, I want to just highlight this, that he wants to devour us, but again, back to the beginning. We believe that we live in a world that was made by a God who made us because he loves us even before he made us. I have a friend who said, God doesn't love us because he made us. He made us because he first loved us. When you read the first chapter of Jeremiah, God says to Jeremiah, before I formed you, I knew you. In fact, it was in my knowing you that I formed you. And before you were born, I called you. I sanctified you to be a prophet to the people. That before we were even formed, God has called us, God has known us, and God has called us and commissioned us, longing for us to bear his image. And one of the ways that we are called to bear his image is to create, is to be in go mode. Yes, there are times when we need to decelerate. There are times when we need that no spoken to us. We're familiar with the Genesis account of creation. And, you got to think, God says to Adam and Eve, here is all of my yes. From any and every tree and plant of the garden, that you can have all that you want. I've given it to you. I've given you my yes with one exception. There is one no. Now, if I'm God and I don't want these cats eating off of this tree, I'd be more like, look, about 40 miles to the west, surrounded in a bunch of brambles and thorns, there's this nondescript bush, this tree. It's got some fruit on it. It's not very attractive. Just if you ever get, well, it's going to take you a long time to get there because you don't even have the wheel yet. But if you ever get there, just leave it alone. No. He plants his no in the center of the garden, right alongside the tree of life. He plants his no right in the center of who we are because his no is as important a part of his love as is his yes. And of course, shame, as we will hear about in the next talk, shame wants to use evil wants to use shame as a way to tell us through our shame attendant that God's yes isn't enough for you. God doesn't really mean yes for you. God doesn't love you in the way that you think he does. That relationship is not nearly as important as you think it is. You're not nearly enough. The only way you're going to be enough is if you have it all, even from the place where God has said no. And so one of the ways that shame tries to find its way into our life is into the very center of the places where God has said no to us. So an important part of our growth, as we will learn about in this next section, when it comes to storytelling, is what does it mean for us to tell our stories where we hear God's yes, but we also hear God's no, recognizing that no is as much a part of his love as is his yes. And what does that have to do with shame? Moreover, when we get to the third part, what does it have to do with its healing and with its regeneration and our recommissioning, especially as it has to do with the particular mission that we're on here to be men of sobriety, men of joy, men of creativity in this organization. So with that, Jay, I think I'm going to wrap up the first talk and we'll move on to questions. I think you're still on mute. Still muted. This is where shame starts to play its role even in these conversations here, right? It's like, oh goodness. Oh my gosh, I've given Curt way too much leash. He's just going to keep talking. How do I find myself? Okay, Jay, hey, I love this. Jay, I would unmute you if I could, but actually I'm just having too much fun watching you try to do this.
There we go.
Very good.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Sorry.
Thanks be to God.
Technology challenged here. So let's get to the questions. We've got a good period of time for questions. Here's the first one, Curt. How do we use our clutch so we can stop less violently? And this guy wants to know, what is the clutch?
So let me give you a couple of examples of that. We'll just start with development, and this is where it's important for us to know, because if we have in our world, in our work in interpersonal neurobiology, we talk an awful lot about the science of attachment. This notion that attachment is this neurophysiologic and relational process wherein which an infant comes into the world and the parents react to the infant, and that infant then attaches to the parent's reactivity. And that attachment process can be insecure or it can be secure. And it can be insecure in a number of different ways, or it can be securely attached. And part of the secure attachment includes this whole notion that when the infant and the toddler are in go mode and need to be decelerated, the question is going to be, as a parent, how do I say no? How do I set limits? Not just that I do set limits, but am I able to come to the infant and say, no, you may not do. Oh, dad understands that you want this, but we can't do that. The tone of my voice, the positioning of my body, how urgent I sound, how able am I in the process of decelerating my toddler or my 15-year-old, in that process, how able am I to remain connected to him? When that connection doesn't take place, shame enters the process. So, for example, the 10-year-old boy comes to his dad with his 92% on his paper. And this is a kid who's worked really hard to get a 92% on his math test. And he presents his paper, his test to his dad, and his dad says, wow, where's the other 8%? Now, if you were to ask the dad, like, what were you thinking? Like, what were you, how is this to be helpful? The dad might say, what? I'm trying to push him. I want him to do better. I want him to do better. There is this sense in which the dad is not aware of the significance of his own relational connection to his son. Now, the dad might have his own fears. The dad might be worried that the kid, he's actually glad that the kid got a 92%, but he wants him to do better, but his fear is getting in the way. And so when we say, what is the clutch? In that situation, the clutch would be the father's awareness of the son's joy in bringing him a 92% and being able to connect with that, and at the same time celebrating that. But the dad would necessarily have to be aware of his own life story. We like to say that the single most powerful way in which we create secure attachment in our children is if we make sense of our own story. We can go to all kinds of parenting classes. That's good. We can work on that relationship. That's good. But we have to take care of our own story first. And when dad's not doing that, dad acts in this way that now what it does, it splices shame together with joy. Here comes this kid. He's in go mode. And shame now neurally becomes linked with the experience of joy. And by the time that kid's 19, he's learned, I don't tell people what I'm going to celebrate because there's too much of a price to pay. So I'm just going to work really hard not to have too much fun. And so how will I cope with that? Oh, pornography is a really fun, private thing to do where I can have fun and nobody else is going to get in the way of this. Nobody's going to come to me and say, well, where's the other 92%? Here's another example. You are an employer and you have someone who comes to you with something that they really want to do, or you have to have that conversation with them about their work and they need to have correction. Like, how are we going to do that? How do you correct someone without shaming them? And one of the things that you do is you recognize that the most important thing that's happening here is the clutch. I'm going to really be connected to this person. And so they say, I would love to do this. They're not ready to do that in the job. And you're going to say to them, I just want to tell you the things that I really see in your life that you're doing really well. And you're going to name those things. And then you're going to say to them, I also really want to commend you for wanting to do this, that you want to have this new promotion, that you want to have that. I really get that. And I'm really glad that you long for that because it shows me that you really want to be at this job. You want to do this job well. Here are some ways in which I think it's going to be important for you to show some more growth in order for you to then step into that role. Let me help you find ways to do that. In this way, you're actually applying the decelerator. You're applying the brake. You're saying, actually, you're not ready for this new promotion. But I want you to know that you want it, that your desire is there, is important, that your longing is there, is important. And I want to honor your longing while setting a limit and making sure that you know that I see you. This is not unlike what happens with the 10-year-old boy also who comes to his dad and says, Dad, I want a new baseball glove for this spring season. And dad says, well, yeah. And we just got you a glove last year. And that glove, because we're in Little League, that glove is still fine. It's a fine glove. Your hand hasn't grown. And how do we say, because, all of his friends are getting new gloves this year and how do we say, you may not have the glove for whatever reason, but I love that you want to play ball at your best. I love that you want to swallow up every ball that comes into the lane at shortstop. And you're saying, like, I know that you want the glove and I know that you want to do well. We can't get the glove this year, but I just want you to know, I love that you want it. And a week later, you're going to come back to that same 10-year-old and you're going to say, I just want you to know, I haven't forgotten that you've asked for the glove. I haven't forgotten how badly you want to do well at this game. I see your longing. I see your desire. And I want to make sure that you get there. And new glove or not, you need to know that I see you working hard, and we'll get there if that's where you want to get to.
Next question. Thank you, Curt. Someone asked, does God through the Holy Spirit ever want us to feel shame to drive a change in us? And maybe you can differentiate between guilt and shame. Or
yeah, this is a great question. This is a question that often comes to me, and that is there any such thing as good shame, right? Is it valuable? Is it one thing I would say from a biblical perspective, we see from the opening lines in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 that shame appears to be the natural consequence, the natural result, the natural experience that the male and the female experience in response to their actions. And so we would say this is something that God has built into the creation. This is something that is a consequence of our actions. When we read St. Paul's words to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, we read these words. There is a godly grief that leads to repentance, and there is an ungodly grief that leads to death. And what I want to suggest is that what Paul is referring to, even though the English words are grief, that Paul's reference fits well in this notion of shame, that shame's purpose in the creation, shame's purpose is to get our attention in terms of our attention toward our actions and our behavior. When we sense that shame, the question is going to be, how do we respond to it? As we'll see in our second talk, what we do in our stories has everything to do with how we respond to shame. Shame is intended to lead us to repentance. There are things that we do in the world for which shame is the proper response. The question is, how do we respond to it? We will see that what evil wants to do is to wield it in such a way that we find ourselves responding in isolation. And it is the isolation that then strengthens shame's response that makes us not only more vulnerable to it, but more likely to continue to reinforce it. But then he goes on to say, there is an ungodly response that leads, there is an ungodly repentance. There's godly grief leads to repentance. Ungodly grief leads to death. This sense that when I sense shame and I respond to it in an ungodly way, I turn away from. We said earlier that there is a turning away, there is a hiding that naturally takes place with shame. And the thing that is different between shame and guilt developmentally, one of the things that we talk about, there's research on these things. And when it comes to guilt, we see that in the first place, as we said earlier, shame shows up neurophysiologically and behaviorally for us as humans at about the age of 15 to 18 months, very early. For guilt, the phenomenon, the neurophysiologic and relational thing that we call guilt doesn't show up until a kid is probably around somewhere between late 3, maybe 4 to 5 years of age. And why is that? Because the thing that we call guilt includes a constellation of events that include, first of all, my sense that I've done something wrong, and the thing that I've done is separate from the me who's done it. I have a greater sense of myself being differentiated from other people, which as a 15-month-old, kids don't have. So there is this me, and then there's the thing that I've done. We said earlier, like, guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. But here's something else that's interesting. With guilt, as I develop, and my brain, my prefrontal cortex has to be developed enough in order for me to have a sense that there's something different between me and the thing I've done, but also that guilt includes this sense that I've done something that has hurt a particular other person. I also have a differentiation between me and the person that my behavior has affected. It's not just I've done a bad thing in some vacuum. I've done a thing that has affected me and this other relationship. And here's what's really interesting about guilt. You take a 6-year-old, you take a 16-year-old, you take a 30-year-old, and if they do something for which guilt is the primary feeling that involves a person with whom they have a close connection, one of the first things that they will want to do is to go to that person to make reparation. They will want to go to that person and say, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? I want things to be right. Shame, we don't do that. Shame moves us away from each other. Shame, by its very nature, has me turning away from you. I can't come to find you. I can't bear to have you see me coming to find you. When we read in the scriptures so often that shame and sin are coupled in the texts, and one of the things that we know that Jesus has done is that God has declared us to be guilt-free, but God could have declared us guilt-free from a distance. God could have waved his magic spiritual wand and said, y'all are free. Y'all are no longer guilty. Just struck his like gavel somewhere. I don't know where. And y'all, you're not guilty. But shame still leaves us in this isolated place. And for this reason, God has to come and get us. And for us in this recovery movement, in this movement, in living without lust, there is this sense in which we gather in this space because we know we need other men to come for us. I'm not just coming here just so that I can do my work and be like educated and be energized and feel better and then so I can go back home. No, I have to come here because like I know that in coming, somebody's coming to find me. Because shame is something that will disallow me from being found. And so you're going to have to come and get me. And we would say that on Good Friday, God said, nothing will stand between me and you. Death is not even going to get in the way. But not only that, not just that. Look, the Romans had all kinds of ways that they could kill people, and they used them. They don't crucify somebody just to kill them. They crucify people to humiliate them and to humiliate the communities in which it takes place. God comes to us in Jesus and says, I'm going to wade right into all of your shame so that you know that there's nothing about your shame that scares me. I'm coming for you. And in the process, I'll strike my gavel as well because I have beautiful things for you to create that you've been blind to from the beginning because this is what evil is up to. But good news is on the way.
Wow. Next question is from somebody who asked this, and I'm going to add a little bit to this. Do you believe that some who struggle with addiction, and we're talking mostly here about lust addiction, are not fully aware of their shame, and therefore it serves as a continued stumbling block for recovery? And I'll just add, there's different common denominators of sex addicts, and a lot of those common denominators have to do with something you already mentioned, which is early porn use, but also sexual abuse, early sexual trauma. I refer to it as two fish swimming in the water, and the one fish says to the other fish, how do you like the water? And the other fish says, what water?
Right.
We're swimming in things that we're not even aware of.
Right.
How does that begin to be healed and unraveled when it comes to shame?
Well, we will. That's gosh, that in many respects that is the $1 million question, isn't it? And we're going to get to that we'll get to that in more detail in our third talk. But I will say this, Jay, at this point, that let me just say this. Jesus, Genesis chapter 1, let us make mankind in our image, right? And, you'd think that if in Genesis chapter 1, if the sequence of events would have followed what had come before, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let the seas teem with fish, and fish teemed in the seas, and so forth and so on. You'd think that if we were going to follow that pattern, we would have gotten to day 6, and God would have said, let there be mankind, and there was mankind. But he didn't. The text indicates that he had a conversation. Let us make mankind in our image. It's like he's stepping back and he's pausing, and there is going to be this reflection, this intention, this buildup, this sense that like something even more important is coming. Now, in my kind of broken way of reading this text, I also imagine this. I imagine the Holy Trinity having this conversation, let us make mankind, and Jesus saying, I'm not sure this is such a good idea. I'm imagining Jesus looking ahead at Good Friday and thinking could we do this a little differently? Is there I'm glad that you paused and didn't just say, let there be mankind. I'd like a choice in the matter. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because Jesus has known from the beginning that this would be our destiny, and they made us anyway. Jesus is not worried. He's not wringing his hands about how long our redemption will take. He is not worried about the fact that our sanctification is going to take the rest of our life. And he's not worried about the fact that our shame has been deeply embedded in some of us since we were young boys because of our sexual abuse history or because we were exposed early and often to pornography. Jesus is not surprised by this, nor is he is undaunted in the face of it. He is not worried about it. He's not unconcerned. He's not worried. He is too busy working on our behalf. We run confessional communities in our practice. And one of the things that come up for people is, they're going to be working through some part of their life in which shame plays a major role, and they work through it. And then they're going to discover that 3 months, 6 months later, something else comes up and shame is rolling right back onto their beach. And they're wondering, where is this? I thought I already dealt with shame. One of the most important things that is to realize about how it is that shame is so early on connected to us neurophysiologically and anthropologically. Like, it's not just early for us, each as personal. Like, we bring our parents' shame into our lives. We bring our grandparents' shame. The epigenetics of the transfer of generational shame. Like, we're not just pushing against our own stuff. We're pushing against the earth. And so it will not surprise God when we feel like we're pushing that hard and it still just takes forever. And this is where the community and the practice of continuing to return to the community that says, yep, this is really tough, and we really hear and sense your shame, and we're not leaving the room. We are not ever leaving the room. It is true that neurophysiologically, especially when it comes to any kind of addiction behavior, I'm sure that many of you have read Gerald May's book, Addiction and Grace, which, if you haven't, I highly recommend it, where he says, look, we're all addicts. The question is, and this is what's important about May's work. He said, what's significant about evil is that it's sneaky. It's the second smartest force on the planet. And it would love for people to think that unless I'm a coke addict, unless I'm a porn addict, I'm not an addict. This is its brilliance, that it thinks that just because I don't have some kind of diagnosable condition, I'm not an idolater. This is what the Bible would call it, right? Bible would call it idolatry. We call it addiction. We're all addicts. And this is the thing, when I have a porn addiction, it's not hard for me to know where my shame is. It's right there. It's embedded in all that. What's interesting is that those who don't have that problem think I don't have that much of a shame problem. Look, the reason I have a job is because people have trouble with shame. I'd like for shame to be healed, but not really that much, because then what would I do for a living, right? So there is a sense in which this is embedded in deep ways, and it is important for us to acknowledge that evil is not about to go quietly into the night. And so it is going to come for us. It is going to want to reinforce, you're going to want to kill your shame attendant, but he's going to come back with his 8th and 9th and 10th lives, all kinds of versions. And it is in this space where we are reminded in Luke's gospel, at the end of Jesus' travail of his 40 days in the desert, prior to his beginning his ministry, we read in the text, and the devil left him for yet another time. And then we watch the devil show up in multiple different places. Jesus knows what it's like. The devil would come back for him and remind him of his shame, remind him of like, hey, look, if you were the Son of God, you would fill in the blank. If you were enough, you wouldn't even have urges to look at porn, let alone look at it. Like you wouldn't even have urges. Like this would be rid from you. And it is in those spaces where we also read in Luke's gospel, like none of the others do we read. Luke's gospel, like none other, shows Jesus is up early and up late in prayer. It shows the energy and the intensity with which Jesus has to approach his life with such seriousness. It's the same seriousness with which God approaches our lives. The seriousness with which we say, shame is going to be here in some way, shape, or form until I'm dead. Not because I am shameful, but because evil wants to devour me. And the closer I get to Jesus, the more desperate evil will become to wield all of those older things. There are lots of other things that we could say in terms of the actual practical applications of what we do in those communities when we address that, which we'll get to in the last part of our time together.
Okay. I think we're at, I think we'll take a break now because we're at 9:59, about 9:58, and it's too much time to get into another question. So let's break now, and we'll be back at 10:05 for talk number 2, which is going to be storytellers, mechanics, and meaning. So we'll take a break, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Very good.